Hello and welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Just want to give people a chance to get in here and get their audio preferences settled before we start. Okay, we'll get rolling here. I'll make sure that I type this out for people that are joining in a bit later, but welcome to today's session on 501c3 status guidance. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few things about this platform and how it works in case you want to ask questions or interact with other participants. So it's very similar, obviously, to Zoom meeting, which I'm sure many of you have used, if not all of you. But just in case you haven't, you can use the chat function to just have discussions or chats with your fellow attendees or with us. Just make sure that you use the everyone selection from the dropdown if you want everyone to see your message. Otherwise, it will just go to hosts and panelists. If you have questions, there's going to be two options. Since we don't have a ton of people in here today, you can always raise your hand and I can unmute you if you want to actually just ask your question out loud, which I feel like in some cases might be a little bit more efficient given the subject matter today. But if you prefer or need to type, if you can put those in the Q&A button, just click that and pop those in there. We'll ask those and take them at the end of the session. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Phil Hunt, VP for Leadership and Management at Acro.
All right. Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, colleagues. I hope that the start of the new academic year is off to a wonderful start for all of you. As Mike said, my name is Philip Hunt. I have the pleasure of serving on Acro's Board of Directors as the Vice President for Leadership and Management Development. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about how you may incorporate your respective state and/or regional association. I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today, Mr. James Goldberg. Jim, as he likes to go by, is a principal in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Goldberg and Associates. His practice focuses on representing trade associations, professional societies, and other types of nonprofit organizations, providing advice on issues such as governance, taxation, contract review, and management. He is outside counsel to Acro, and Jim received his undergraduate degree from Syracuse University. Jim, I should have paid closer attention to that as a UConn guy, but I won't hold that against you. But also received his law degree from the George Washington University. Welcome, Jim, and thank you on behalf of our members for your willingness to be with us today.
Thank you, Phil. And I won't talk about the football game till after it's over. I've suffered through too many lean years in watching Syracuse football. So we'll just save that for another day.
All right.
Thanks for the opportunity to spend a few minutes and talk about 501c3 status for your association. I hate to start off with a disclaimer, but I'm required to by the District of Columbia Bar, which essentially says that although I'm a lawyer, this presentation does not present legal advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship. So all I'm doing is trying to educate the audience as to some of the requirements to obtain tax-exempt status, and more specifically, under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. First, a word about organizational structure. The question is, are you incorporated? And the last check I did about 3 weeks ago, Acro has 39 state and regional groups. There are 25 that are incorporated and 14 that are not incorporated. I think it's my suggestion that you look into incorporation, but it's not for everybody. And you need to ascertain your own status, your own situation before making this determination. The next question is, whether you're incorporated or not, are you tax exempt? And here it's a simple answer. You either are or you're not. And if you're not tax exempt, then you have to file income tax returns with the Internal Revenue Service every year, notwithstanding that you may only have a small net income at the end of the year. Tax exemption requires an application to the IRS. You don't just get it by being a good citizen or a good organization. There's essentially two types of tax exemption that are available to ACRO state and regional organizations. There's actually 24 or 27 categories of tax exemption, including such things as social clubs, social welfare organizations, unions. But there's the two that are most applicable to state and regional associations like yours are 501c3 and 501c6. And the difference is C6 associations generally are defined as promotion of a line of business. An ACRO state or regional organization could qualify under 501c6. And in some respects, it's an easier lift than complying with 501c3. But there are differences between the two as to what you can do. C3s are educational organizations, like the institutions that you work for and work with, colleges, universities, private schools, churches, and organizations like ACRO, which perform an educational function for their membership and for the public. C3 status has some benefit. And this is why a lot of people, a lot of organizations choose a C3 status. Dues or contributions to the organization are deductible as charitable contributions. Now, even though a C3 organization is not technically a charity, like the American Red Cross or the Cancer Society or the Heart Association, dues and contributions are deductible to the donor as charitable contribution. That means if your members are individual members as opposed to institutional members, they can deduct their dues payment on their 1040 tax return as a charitable contribution. The big benefit of a C3 status is that it often provides exemptions for some or all state taxes, such as income taxes, sales taxes, and personal property taxes. Sales tax exemption is not a given. You have to apply for it. In some states, if you get a tax exemption under C3 from the Internal Revenue Service, you're automatically tax exempt under state law. But if you're going to go the C3 route, it's a good idea. And in fact, it's sort of required to ascertain whether you have to file for a specific tax exemption at the state or local level. But it can save the organization considerable amount of money as the year drags on. Before you can apply for tax exempt status under C3, there's some organizational work that needs to be done. Every organization that applies must have organizational documents, that is articles of incorporation or bylaws or bylaws. For an unincorporated association, many have what's called a constitution, which is similar to articles of incorporation. And in order to obtain a C3 tax exemption, these organizational documents have to contain what I call the IRS required magic words. You have to state that the purpose of the organization is educational. You have to state that there is something called no inurement. And what that means is that none of the proceeds of the organization go to any individual except as payment for services rendered. So you could pay a member to act as executive director. You just can't split the profit or net income with that person at the end of the year. C3 candidates are prohibited from supporting political candidates, but can do a limited amount of lobbying. It's a very complex formula, but a limited amount of lobbying is permitted. And then to obtain a C3 status, you have to provide that upon the dissolution of the organization, the assets go to some other recognized C3 organization, like a charity, like an educational institution. You can't just say, if we go out of business, we'll carve up the money in the bank to all of our members at the time. So once you do the pre-application work, the application takes place online. And the IRS, like a lot of government agencies, is going to an internet-based system of application. You file online at the website called pay.gov, and you'll need a user ID and password to access that site. And once you access the site, you have a choice. If projected gross revenue does not exceed $50,000 for 3 years, then you can use what's called the 1023 EZ. It's a very simple form. It simply says, here's my name, here's my address, here's my tax ID number. And I hereby certify that our projected gross income or our past gross income has not exceeded $50,000. Now note the use of the word gross revenue. This is total money coming in. It's not money left over at the end of the year after payment for all expenses. So if you have a conference or convention and have other activities, and that brings in $51,000 and you spend 50, then you can't use the 1023 EZ. You have to do the more lengthy Form 1023. And the 1023 gets a little bit complicated because it tends to ask questions like, do you have a whistleblower policy? Do you have, who reviews your tax filings and things like that? The answers are not required to obtain a tax exemption. They're sort of hints to guide you along to good practice for tax exempt organizations. You don't have to have a whistleblower policy, but a lot of organizations feel that it doesn't look good to say, no, I don't have one. So you need to adopt one if you want to say yes. But if you say no, it won't affect your status as obtaining a tax exempt status under C3. And then there are required tax filings. Just like if you're not tax exempt, you have to file an federal income tax return. There are required tax filings. Mike, put the slide next, please. If your gross receipts are under $50,000, you file online something called the 990N, which is commonly referred to as the e-postcard. And again, if your gross receipts are under 50,000, you simply file a statement on the website that says, I'm here, I'm still in business, and I'm hereby certifying that our gross revenue for the most recent taxable year is under $50,000. If you fail to file for 3 years running, the IRS will automatically revoke your tax exempt status, and you have to basically start all over again. If your gross receipts are between 50,000 and 200,000, you file something called a 990 EZ. And again, this is done online. And it's a little bit more complicated than the postcard. And if you happen to be like ACRO, an organization whose gross receipts are more than $200,000, you file a Form 990, which is much more complex and detailed. One thing to keep in mind about these 990 series of forms, they're all publicly available information. So while I have the title tax filings, they're really information returns. And anybody can look up on a website called guidestar.org, the 990 form of virtually all tax exempt organizations in the United States. And you can glean a lot of financial information about that organization. And that's about it. It sounds simple. It can be complex and confusing, but I think we have time for questions. We have a lot of time for questions if you have them.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Appreciate that insight. Now's the time for questions. Folks can put something in the chat, or because this is a fairly small group, if you want to raise your hand, we will call on you. At least there's a hand raised. Did you mean to keep that hand raised, or was that based on the message that you put in the chat earlier about it freezing? Oh, hand was down. Okay.
Yeah, Jim, at one point, when you first started talking about the 1023 easy form, you froze up for about 5 seconds. If you could, I think the person that raised their hand just wanted to kind of recover that portion if you could.
Okay, if you want to apply to the IRS for tax exempt status, you do so online at a site called www.pay.gov. And it requires a user ID and password to access the site and create a form. You click on, it'll ask you what form you want to file. You say, I want to file the form 1023EZ, which you can use if your actual or projected gross revenue does not exceed $50,000, either prospectively if you're a new organization or retrospectively if you've been around for a while. Gross revenue means total income coming in the front door. It doesn't mean the amount of money left over at the end of the year. So if you have a convention and it brings in $51,000 and you spend 50, you can't use the 1023EZ because your gross revenue exceeds 50. If your gross revenue exceeds 50,000, you file the more complicated 1023 form, which is also available online. And you can work through it. There is a way to print it out before you file it, before you start answering the question, because sometimes that's more helpful than going slide by slide and not knowing what's around the corner on slide 7 if you're working on slide 6. So I hope that answers the question.
I believe it did. We'll wait on a few more here. And just while we wait for questions to come in, I just want to reiterate that this session is being recorded and we can, Jim, is it okay? It doesn't seem like there's any kind of proprietary information if we make the presentation available.
No, that's
online.
fine.
Great.
We've confused everybody, or we've explained it easily enough.
Question in the chat, is this presentation available as a PDF? I'm sure we can convert it to a PDF, but when we make it available, that will be how it will be made available, sure. Here's a question, what has to be in the dissolution agreement for it to be valid?
You don't really need to have a dissolution agreement. You need to have a provision in your articles of incorporation or bylaws that simply says that upon dissolution of the organization, the remaining assets after payment of all bills and expenses will be distributed to, and then you insert who gets the money that's left over. You can leave it vague and say it'll go to any other 501c3 organization, or you can specify that it'll go to a particular entity by name. Most states require that you also file, if you're incorporated, file articles of dissolution or articles of termination or certificate of termination with the State Corporation Commission so that they know you no longer exist and can take you off their rolls.
Good question. Other questions?
Just while maybe more people are coming in, I think in the past you've talked about how it might be advisable to hire professional help when preparing the 1023. Can you speak to the kind of, when you say it's complex, would you say it is reasonable for somebody that doesn't have much of an accounting background to take that on by themselves?
The filing, well, there's two things. The 1023 is the application for exemption. I think that can generally be done by the organization itself. Maybe a little guidance, maybe some review by somebody who understands the tax exempt application process. Because one of the things you have to do if you're a larger organization is to indicate all of your activities and specify how they relate to your exempt purpose. In other words, if your exempt purpose is education, then you put in your list of activities. We hold an annual conference every year, and you should explain that the annual conference includes educational activity that's aimed at promoting or making our members more knowledgeable about best practices in the college admissions process. You have to come up with 3 year, if you're filing a 1023 in particular, the more complex form, you have to come up with 3 years of income and expense statement. We've usually found that for the application process, most of the information has to come from the organization itself. If somebody came to me and said, would you file an exemption application? I turn it back to them and say, I can't make up the stuff that you do. Just tell me what you do and how you do it, and I can tweak it so that it fits in to the IRS requirement. Doing a 990, if you're a large organization, is much more complex, and that generally requires specialized accounting help.
Great, thank
The
you.
lawyers or accountants can do the 1023 application. It's accountants who generally do the tax file.
So it looks like we have a question in the chat by Ari, and he asks, you may have already mentioned this, some 501c3 organizations still have to file an annual Form 990 return to the IRS. What is the criteria to determine who needs to file one?
It depends on your gross revenue for the most recent fiscal or calendar year, whichever you use. If your gross revenue is under $50,000 a year, you file annually what's called the 990N, which is commonly referred to as the e-postcard. This is done online, and it's essentially a statement that says, I'm here, we're still in business, continue our tax exempt status, and we hereby certify that our gross revenue is under 50,000. If you're between 50,000 and 200,000, you file a 990EZ online, which is a little bit more complex, but still I think can be done without accounting help. And these are online filings that again, I've used the title tax filing, but they're really not tax filings. Technically, they're information return, which means the IRS makes them public and anybody can go looking and find out what your gross revenue is and how it's spent. That's how newspapers find out how much football coaches at state universities are paid. They do a 990 review and they find out that the football coach is making 10 or 12 million a year and the university president is making $1.50.
Okay, let's see. So the follow-up question to that, so every 501c3 has to file one of these 990 variations. No 501c3 can just skip filing one.
No, you can't. If you skip filing for 3 years, your tax exempt status automatically gets revoked. But likewise, if you're not taxing, and this holds true whether if you're not a C3 but a C6, as I know 1 or 2 state and regional organizations are, you still have to file a 990 return. It's not particular to C3s. If you're not tax exempt, you still have to account for the money somehow, and that requires a corporate tax or a business tax filing. So either way, you got to tell the IRS how much money is coming in and how much goes out.
Great questions, Ari. Others? Okay. Well, not seeing any additional questions, as Mike noted, we will go ahead and we will send out the presentation. It also was recorded. Thanks, Jim, again for the time with us today and imparting your expertise for our members. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to discuss this very important topic, and hopefully our membership got a lot out of it.
Glad to do it. And I would just add in closing that if any of the audience has any questions after we're done, they can email them to me directly or send them to ACRO through Mike or somebody else, and we'll get the answer to you.
Well, fantastic. All right, everybody. I hope you have a great day and great rest of the week. It was great seeing you all on here. Take care.